Hey there, my fellow lunatics, and welcome to Dakon's Madhouse. Are you tired of spending hours searching for the chipped blade? Do you wish that you could just know exactly where every major scene was on your map before you even started exploring? Well, this video won't fix that second problem, but it can help you with the first. Today, we're going to go over how Corekeeper does scene generation so that you can have a better understanding of why your world is spawning the way it is. World or scene generation in Corekeeper is not something that can just be loaded completely into a map editor or a tool. The world generates as you explore it. The map is broken down into multiple sections that generate and populate as you explore. First, let's define some terms that are going to be commonly used throughout this video. There are two types of world generation. Classic is the world generation style from early access. This world is infinite, but it does not contain the passage biome, and you will only find the Shimmering Frontier as sub-biome patches rather than as its own entire ring. A finite world with new seed and more deterministic world generation. This is the default world design from 1.0 onward. It includes all biomes like the Passage and the Shimmering Frontier as its own biome. The devs for Corekeeper have divided the map into three spawn categories. First, the respawn cell. These are more commonly known as spawn cells. They are 16 by 16 tiles that control the respawn rate of mobs within the game. They do not affect scene generation at all though, and we're probably not going to mention them again. Scene chunks. These are 64 by 64 tile chunk grids that control scene generation in classic worlds. Now, these do exist in modern worlds, but they are not the primary driving force for scene generation. For that, we're going to need number 3, the spawn chunk. These are 256 by 256 tile chunks that break down into a 4x4 scene chunk within them. These are the primary driving force of scene generation in modern worlds, and they do not exist at all in classical worlds. The devs switched to this style to ensure that every scene and dungeon fits into a spawn chunk and that nothing ever gets broken apart when it's generated. Additionally, there are two types of spawn scenes. These are static scenes that never change. These include the mazes, player-made scenes that were added from the Discord competition, the giant shell scenes in the Sunken Sea, things like that. Anything that the art team created to look one specific way and that specific scene is dropped in unaltered. Dynamic scenes that change their layout or overall design in each world. Examples include the Metropolis cities, the Molten Quarry sub-biome, those ruined houses in the Forgotten Ruins, or Hive Mother's Lair. These dungeons piece together multiple smaller scenes to create a unique procedurally generated design in each world. The game also contains a list of unique scenes that are required to spawn. The game prioritizes these scenes when generating scene spawns. These include the boss arenas, the Metropolis dungeons, and other important locations like the scenes for the Rune Song or the Phantom Bow pieces. When a scene generates, these scenes get priority and will spawn first. However, there are unique scenes where spawn is not guaranteed. This includes scenes like the Amber Larva, which it is technically a unique spawn, but it doesn't always spawn in every world. This is because all scenes have an upper limit of how many can spawn in a single world. This amount can be 0, but it can never be more than the set cap. Things like the Amber Larva are set to 1, which means that it can spawn 0 times or 1 time. This is done for scenes where the item acquired in it can also be acquired through other means. Only scenes where an item is completely impossible to get otherwise will be included in the required spawn list. Again, using the amber larva as the example, you can find the amber larva on Gorm, and I believe it also spawns in the hive areas in chests randomly. So since you can acquire the amber larva from means other than the scene, it is not included in the required spawn list, despite the fact that it is a unique scene. Classic worlds are infinite. Because of this, they have a different layout. The passage biome does not exist, and the Shimmering Frontier would be classified more as a dungeon or sub-biome than as its own thing. Each of the 3 outer biomes take up 1/3 of the map. The exact positioning of the biome edges changes with each map, but the locations of the biome edges generate when the map does. This lets the map know exactly where the biome edges are. This also lets the game place certain scenes that it has to know their location of before the player has even explored the map. In a classic map, this includes every dungeon and boss location that had a fixed distance from the core. Examples include the large metropolis cities, Titan chambers, etc. The map doesn't actually generate them yet, but it puts a placeholder so that it knows where each of these locations will generate. The game then generates the first 4 scene chunks as soon as you load into the game. Remember, each scene chunk is 64 tiles long. Once you get to about 20 tiles or so from the edge of the chunk, the next scene chunk will load. The game will then check the placeholder list and see if a unique dungeon is supposed to spawn in that chunk. If not, then the game will go to a different list where the other scenes and dungeons reside and attempt to spawn one of them. Only one scene will spawn in a scene chunk. And I have to note that the table which determines which scenes spawn has a very high probability of choosing no scene. The probability of a dungeon or a scene spawning varies depending on the dungeon or scene, as well as the biome. For example, in the dirt biome, the odds of getting a slime dungeon is around 25%, as are the odds of getting a meadow sub-biome. If neither of those 2 things spawn, then the game would check for smaller scenes that haven't reached their spawn limit and either place that scene or just fill the chunk with random terrain. This terrain generation has created 2 major problems for the developers. The first was that map generation relied on knowing exactly where the biome edges were. This prevented them from altering how the 3 outer biomes were generated and made it difficult to place the Shimmering Frontier and passage biomes around the outer biomes. The second issue was that with the exception of bosses at the beginning, none of the scene or dungeon generation is deterministic. For example, if I was to explore a world and I head east until I generated the start of a large dungeon like a mold biome or metropolis, and then I reverse course and come at it from a completely different direction, like for example, I head way north so that I'm not going to trigger its generation as I then go all the way around and come at it heading west from the other side completely, then I could end up generating a completely different scene as it's not reading and triggering the fact that I have a metropolis there. This can cause scene mismatches or other complete chaos. This also has problems if someone else, like if you're playing multiplayer and one person comes in from one direction and another person comes in from a totally different one, and you generate totally different scenes in the chunks next to each other and they don't match. That was a problem that happened in Classic Worlds. Additionally, if I wanted to share my world seed, there was no world seed in Classic Worlds, but either way, there was no guarantee that another player would get the same layout that I had, which is why they didn't include world seeds in the original Classic World information. Since everything spawned randomly as I explore, there was just no consistency. I'll always have a unique world with unique placement, even if that seed was shareable and I gave it to another player. Their exploration pattern would be different, and as a result, all scene generation would be completely different. Modern worlds have removed the clear and obvious distinction between the biomes. While there is still a biome border, the biomes blend more and don't have as much of that empty space between them that the classic worlds had. This also works well for world settings and is what allows them to create a more chaotic world environments. When the modern world is first created, the game assigns potential spawn points for the same unique dungeons and boss arenas that it does in a classical world. The difference now is that it no longer fixes them to a specific distance. The game does have a target distance that it places as a top priority for certain dungeons. And in a new world, the odds of the game spawning at these distances is almost always guaranteed, but they are going to vary a little bit. Any one of the spawns can vary by upwards of 50 to, let's say, 70 or 80 tiles. It definitely can vary a bit. But let's list off all of the spawn locations and their preferred distance. Now remember, the game won't always spawn it in this exact distance, but it will spawn it as close as possible to this number. Once those scenes and dungeons are mapped out, the game generates the first spawn chunk, which also triggers the scene generation in all the smaller scene chunks within. So unlike classic worlds, which only generate 64 by 64 tile spaces when you explore, modern worlds generate 256 by 256 tile spaces as you explore. This fixes the classic world issue of partially generating a giant scene or dungeon and then combining it at a different angle and generating a different scene. None of the game's scenes are bigger than a 256 by 256 grid, and the game is able to control scene layouts better. When you get to the closest 64 by 64 scene chunk into the next spawn chunk, that new spawn chunk grid will load. An interesting fact about Gorm is that Gorm exists in the world and moves through it, carving his path. Because of this, Gorm triggers the scene chunk generation as he moves through him. Therefore, the entire inner biome will be fully generated within about 5 minutes or so of the game starting, as Gorm will complete a circuit, generating each chunk. Now, let's go ahead and take a closer look at what happens in each spawn chunk when it loads. This is an example of a single spawn chunk. Each circle in this grid represents a scene that the game has generated for this specific chunk. The layout of the circles is going to be different in every game. The red circle represents mandatory uniques that the game placed and loaded. The central small circle in this instance is the core, and the larger circle with all the smaller ones around it, that's Glurch's dungeon. When we zoom in on Glurch, we can see how the game lays out the dungeon. Dungeons generate slightly differently with each seed, and in this one, we can see smaller central circle, and then each branching circle shows pathing generated to other parts of Glurch's arena. Finally, the waypoint itself also spawns along the outer edge of the giant circle. Green circles on the map are dungeons. Dungeons can be sub-biomes as well. So this is where meadows spawn, and slime scenes, and ruin houses as examples. Blue or cyan circles are custom scenes, which includes the smaller scenes or anything that isn't procedurally generated. Finally, the white circles are scene locations that were allocated, but nothing spawned in them, and they just got filled in with random terrain. Scene and dungeon generation in these chunks has a priority weighting. Therefore, the game is most likely to spawn specific scenes before other scenes. Dungeons like the Meadows or Caveling Ruins have a higher chance of spawning. Same is true for scenes like the Giant Mushroom area or any of the Melody Chambers. Unfortunately, I don't know the exact weight of every scene, but since the game prioritizes more scenes in the earliest spawn chunks loaded, you're going to have fuller spawn chunks early in your explorations. There is an order to how the game generates scenes as well. It places large scenes and dungeons first, then medium ones, and finally fills the remaining space with small scenes. Now, let's take all this knowledge and put it to some practical use. You're trying to find a specific scene. Unfortunately, the Thread of Fate is a unique spawn, so it generates at the start of the game and is placed randomly anywhere within the desert. So there's really nothing that can help you find that faster or easier. The Chipped Blade Temple is a bit mixed. Up to 3 can spawn in a world, and 1 is guaranteed to spawn. So the first spawn of the temple generates within the world seed at the creation of the world. It is placed completely randomly and can be anywhere in Azios's wilderness. But the second and the third temple are not unique or guaranteed, and they spawn during chunk generation into the small blue circles. Additionally, there are other scenes that we may want to find, scenes like the Amber Larva, Paradise Fruit, or the Amalgam Basin. To improve our chance to find these kinds of scenes quickly, we want to explore in a grid-like fashion, going through each scene chunk within the spawn chunk. Because the game fills in the spawn chunk with as many small scenes as it can, the first chunk is most likely to have the smaller scenes within them. Then you'll find larger scenes are more common as you max out on the small scene spawn caps, until you find that scenes in general just become scarce. If you reach a point that you're just finding empty desert, open ocean, or really nothing but random wilderness blocks, you've probably started reaching the end of your scene generation in the biome. That means it's time to turn around and explore back the way you came. Those first grids of 256 by 256 tiles will be where most of the scenes and dungeons will spawn. So to sum up, your odds of finding the smaller, rare scenes you're hunting for are actually higher when you first enter the biome. Be your most thorough at the start. The devs want you to find stuff, so everything is front-loaded. Now, unfortunately, at the time of this recording, the map tool has not been updated to include these larger spawn chunks. I was lucky enough to interview the developer who designed this system, Gravenstein, and he was kind enough to show me a bit of the behind the scenes where I got the images for spawn chunks and the circles within. So thanks again to Gravenstein and to everyone at Pugstorm for being willing to take the time to show me how all of this works. I do really appreciate it. I hope you found this video informative and helpful. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to hit that like button, subscribe for future content, and if you are feeling really generous, please join us on Patreon or become a YouTube member. Your support means the world to me, and I can't do it without you. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. Stay happy, stay healthy, and above all, stay crazy.